Starting the recording. Okay, here we go. Welcome, everybody. I'm sure we'll have more students coming in soon. So this is our Unit 3 document discussion, and we're going to be discussing the founders' views on slavery, which is always a fascinating topic and full of, well, as this handout said, an inconsistency not to be excused, which is an actual quote from one of the documents. So we will get started. It's going to be a pretty freewheeling discussion. I've got some points I want to bring up, but I'd like to start first with just sort of a big idea. Has anyone here, I don't know, maybe some of you has anyone taken AP psychology yet? Yep, Ephraim has, okay. Good. There's a concept called cognitive dissonance. Does anyone know what that is? Has anyone come across? Ephraim?
Yes.
Okay.
It's where you hold a set of ideas, but your actions are contrary to those ideas.
Right. You're not matching up. Your actions aren't matching your ideas, your stated, deeply felt ideas. Right. Exactly. And does anyone know like some of the problems that being engaged in cognitive dissonance can cause? What does it make people do? Helen, how about you? And then Ashwin.
I think it would make you seem less trustworthy because you're seeing them do this, like talk about this one thing, like slavery and how it's wrong, but then they go back and own 200 slaves, and it's like, what?
This doesn't equate, right? Something's out of balance here, right? So it makes other people look at them and say, what a hypocrite. Okay, good. And Ashwin, do you have something else to add there?
Yeah, it also makes them sound logical when they try to justify the dissonance. They make a logical jump that sounds, very illogical to someone watching who doesn't have the dissonance.
Right. People try to justify what their position is and why it doesn't match up. Well, you're just not understanding in the full sense. I mean, I know this sounds like cognitive dissonance, but really, so you try to justify it, and that may not fly with others who are listening. Very good. So I think that's a helpful way to kind of look at these founders and their views on slavery, especially the ones who, like Helen said, they're espousing what sound like anti-slavery ideas, core beliefs, but at the same time, they're still engaged in owning slaves. Hi, Aiden. Good to see you. And we're just talking, Aiden, here briefly about the idea of cognitive dissonance. Have you ever heard of that idea? Maybe not. It's kind of a psychology term. And but it's when you're believing something, but you're doing something different, that you don't match up. And I think that's a thing to consider here in this, and we'll be kind of discussing that all through the evening. But just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. I'd like if we could just have somebody brave jump in and share about the documents that they looked into and some things that they noticed, some things that made them scratch their heads, some things that didn't seem to make sense. How can they do this? How can they say this? Why did they believe this? Or did some make sense to you? Did you have the feeling of, wow, I finally get it. I understand why they had these sort of convoluted views here. Ashwin.
Sure. So I looked at, maybe to start off, I looked at John Adams. So his views on slavery were very typical, I would say, more of someone from the North. He's a Bostoner, right? So he was seeing it as a bad thing, but he figured that it was going downwards anyways, and we had bigger things to worry about. But his view of slavery seems to be influenced from the Bostonian kind of slavery, where you don't have people working in fields because you don't have those in Boston. So he's really thinking of, how slaves and
servants,
whatnot,
right.
which
Mhm.
could have been going down, but statistically speaking, slavery was actually in a sharp increase. So
Mhm.
he really did not like slavery, but he felt like there were bigger priorities to worry about.
Yeah, yeah. And that was an interesting document because it was, oh, here, and this is kind of like something I noticed about a lot of a lot of the documents were letters, like that one with John Adams. He was writing a letter to someone, and a lot of them are in this same sort of format. They're writing basically thank you letters. And what are they thanking people for in a lot of these cases? There were like 5 or 6 of them that were doing this. It's like, thank you very much. I am in receipt of your gift of blank. What were the gifts? They were, I mean, you don't have to guess, but you can peek back at the page, but they were usually gifts of, here's my new booklet against the international slave trade. Here's my new book on why slavery is terrible. Here's my article about the education of Blacks. Here's my book written by Blacks in France, showing how smart they are. Okay? So they're books that are trying to refute these standard views of enslavement. And they're sending these to famous people, people who publish these things. You can imagine why would people want to send an anti-slavery book to someone like John Adams or to someone like Thomas Jefferson or to someone like Washington? Ocean.
Those were kind of the guys with the power then.
Mm-hmm.
Like especially after the revolution, they were kind of the big people in town. And even
Right.
before the revolution, they were the elites, they were the merchants.
Mm-hmm.
So they were the ones who could actually make the change.
Do things right. They're not going to send a free copy unsolicited of a book to someone who was a peasant, or a washerwoman or something. They're going to send it to someone who might have some power to do something. They're hoping to persuade them. And so I think it's important to think of, like, if you were a famous elite person and you got one of these gifts in the mail, unsolicited, you didn't order the book, okay? You were just sent it. You realized why the person sent it to you. You probably also realized, okay, this is not something I'm going to be able to do anything about. But what sort of response would you make? What would be sort of your tone if you were a nice, civilized person? Ashwin.
I'd probably thank them for the book and explain my position.
Yeah, you'd thank them. You'd be nice. You might even say, you make some excellent points. This is a terrible problem. There is no one more than I who would love to see something firm done to end this, terrible situation. Okay? Knowing full well you're not going to do a darn thing. Because probably you feel, well, why wouldn't they do anything? Ashwin?
Okay, probably because they had views to the contrary, or they thought it would cause division. They probably have bigger priorities than to, um, you know, listen to what a random book says that they were sent unsolicited in the mail. So they probably want to just thank the person, but not really have to do much work about it, because then people would just start sending them random books in the mail.
More
to
and
get stuff
more.
done.
Right. They'll have me, right. Right. So you want to be polite, but a little evasive, right? And that's what I think you can see in a lot of these responses. They're trying to be polite, they're trying to be gentlemen, but they're not going to commit themselves. And so that is, there are quite a few of these that are that sort. Someone is trying to persuade them, they're thanking them, and they're saying, well, I'm really busy. I just can't do anything about this right now. And notice when Adams receives his book in the mail, it's what was it, like something like January of 1801. He is president, but how much longer is he going to be president? Not long, says Ephraim. Not long. He's just about out. He knows he did not win. He knows Jefferson is coming in. By the way, Adams will not go to Jefferson's inauguration. He skips town and leaves. So yeah, he's probably feeling like, here I am trying to pack up the White House and just leave, and I can't do anything. I'm a lame duck president, and this guy now wants me to end slavery. Great. So the timing for Adams was off, but he also wanted him to know that, okay, I'm one of the good guys. Never owned a slave. I'm one of the good guys. I'm on your side. I agree with you. But, there are lots of other problems. So, yeah, who wants to share about their document that they read? Saraga.
I read both the Jefferson ones.
Mhm.
I think it was interesting how he enslaved 600 people over his lifetime, and yet in his draft for the Declaration of Independence, he blames King George III for keeping slavery in America.
Right. Not him, not Jefferson, but yeah.
Certainly not the man
Right.
who did the enslaving.
Right. Well, an interesting thing though to keep in mind, I'm not justifying the practice, but it was a reality. And I think a lot of these guys like Jefferson felt this. If Jefferson owned during his adult lifetime as many as 600 enslaved people, did he purchase every one of those 600?
I think the article I read said he purchased some of them and inherited a lot from his father.
He inherited a lot from his father, right? And
Like,
there-
he still had like complete authority to free them, but he didn't because they're making him money.
right. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be an important thing, that there were, especially right after the Revolution, there were people in Virginia who did free their slaves. There were some, not many, but a couple of dozen people who had large slave holdings, and they freed all of their slaves. They felt convicted, and they said, okay, enough. I think this is wrong. I think this is inconsistent. I don't want to have cognitive dissonance, so I am going to free all my slaves. And some did it. I don't know if anybody read let's see, the document on Virginia manumission law of 1782, which is right at the very end of the Revolution, like before the peace treaty. But that was a whole article about, anyone know what the word manumission means? Wouldn't mean much unless you knew what that meant. Anyone know what that means? Do a quick Google of it right now. It means freeing slaves. Sort of like emancipation, but this is manumission. So it means freeing the slaves. So this is a law about how slaves could be freed. Because, believe it or not, there were laws about this. There were laws about all these things. I mean, we remember that PSDA on colonial slave laws in Virginia. There were a surprising number of laws. There weren't just laws that said, oh yeah, slavery is legal. No. They were much more complicated than that. And they had laws put in to say how you could free your slaves. And one of your ways would be in your last will and testament, like you're planning to, or you're going to die sometime soon. So you can say that once I die, all my slaves shall be freed. And if it's properly signed and all this, that would be okay. But one of the things they also put in this law in Virginia was if you free your slaves, you must send them out of the state of Virginia to another state. Why would they make a rule like that? What would be the purpose of that? Tabitha.
Well, maybe they were worried about having a lot of freed slaves living in the state 'cause they were worried that the people who had been slaves and then were set free would stir up people who were still enslaved to rebel against their masters.
Yeah, they viewed that. We had that in that remember that MCQTT, that very early one on the slave ads, the runaway slave ads, where we talked about that a little bit, that they would not have wanted enslaved people to be socializing with free Blacks. They would have seen that as dangerous, as encouraging others to run away or to seek freedom. You know, in any way. I mean, there were always slaves who tried to strike deals with their owners to say, okay, if I earn a little money on the side over the next 5 or 10 years, can I buy my freedom? Yeah, sure, great idea. There were always some slave owners who would agree to that. And there were slaves who tried that. It wasn't a very viable thing. There were, for every case of a slave who was able to buy their own freedom from an owner, there would probably be 10 who the slave owner said, yeah, sure, great idea, do some extra work and save your money. That's a great idea. And then they would steal the slave's money or say they didn't live up to their side of the bargain. And so they're just going to keep all the money and not free them. You know, that you really had no rights in that. But yeah, so you had to send slaves out of the country. There was one guy, he was actually a relative of Thomas Jefferson, a very eccentric, kind of weird guy, Randolph, who in the like 1810s or so freed all his slaves, and he sent them to Ohio. And does anyone know about, was slavery allowed in the state of Ohio? No, why not? Anyone know?
Because slavery was outlawed in the Northwest Territories.
Right. The one good thing to come out of the Articles of Confederation, it's always brought up as the one good thing. Slavery was outlawed there. But do you think that meant that Ohio viewed themselves as being a haven for freed and emancipated slaves? They actually tried to put in that no free Blacks could move in. And many other states in that band, like Indiana, Illinois, had very similar laws at times, that you could not move in if you were a freed Black. They tried to limit. So, okay, you couldn't let your slaves stay in Virginia. You would somehow have to very expensively pay for their transportation somewhere else where they would be accepted, and they might not be accepted everywhere. So are they trying to make the process of manumission, of emancipation, easy? No. They're really, these laws made it very difficult. Some still did it, but it was difficult. It was difficult, not easy. And who wants to share briefly about their some of the documents they looked at? Harriet.
So I wrote about like an excerpt from a speech that Benjamin Franklin made.
Mm-hmm.
And like I did not really understand the context behind it.
Mhm.
But I learned some from your response for me. But I liked it because it was a speech, and so it felt like, I don't know, you could see his like kind of writing powers at work and social powers, which he was kind of known for. But he was just talking about like how freeing like enslaved people might not be like that's not enough, and that like their whole lives they've like lived in slavery, and so they wouldn't be set up to like be free members of society. And he's like talking about like this great annexed plan of like how they were gonna like restore all these free all these slaves, and then they were gonna like find jobs for them and then teach their kids, and it was gonna be like really great. And I didn't know what that plan was.
Right,
But
right.
and
Yeah. They did
I
that.
thought it was interesting.
Yeah, and that abolition society in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, which would largely be Quakers. There were a lot of Quakers in Philadelphia, and they did start a school. They started a big school for free Black children, and they did make an honest effort to help them learn, help them teach. They did not, and that's like in contrast to down in, South Carolina, where it's going to be illegal to teach a slave to read, and by that, who would get punished if it was found out that a slave was being taught to read? Who would be punished? What do you think, Sarah?
The slave and whoever was teaching the slave.
Yeah, probably the slave would be punished, and whoever was found to be teaching him. Like sometimes like in Frederick Douglass's case, the woman owner of one of his owners when he was a child didn't understand these customs. And so she had a little boy that she was teaching to read, her own son. Frederick Douglass was like his companion, helped out with this little boy. So she taught Frederick Douglass how to read too, the beginnings of reading. And her husband, when he found this out, got furious at her because he knew they could get into real trouble if this was found out. And so she stopped teaching him how to read, but he'd already gotten, it was like too late. He'd already gotten a feel for it, and he then worked with other local boys. He'd sort of, I'll give you a piece of gum if you teach me a few letters, that sort of thing. And or I'll do some work for you if you teach me how to read this page. And so, yeah, but they made it difficult for people to exercise what they might want to do. Good. And who else wants to share about what documents they looked into? I know we haven't heard. Aiden, which one did you look into? I can't remember right off. Do you remember? I can look it up. Here, I got yours. You looked at John Adams' reply letter, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yep. And yeah, you made a big thing that Adams made a point that there were many other evils in the land that had to be attended to first, including, you picked up on the fact that he was really saying people need more Christian education or more Christian moral beliefs, that was more of a problem. He also, I know some of you who did that Adams letter noted that he said that, well, I've heard that there are poor whites who are actually worse off than some slaves. And some people were like, some of you who did that document kind of responded and said, well, that's really stupid. Obviously that wasn't very thoughtful and not true. And how many of you have read, a lot of you read it for your summer book review, To Kill a Mockingbird? Did any of you hear? Okay, Aiden did, yeah. And remember, those of you who've read it, and if you haven't read it, read it sometime this year. It's a good book. There's a family, is it the Ewells, Aiden? Is that the name of the poor white family? I think they're the Ewells. A poor white family, and the way that people would refer to these families would be calling them white trash. And white trash families are a thing. They are a thing. And I found there's one book written about poor whites, white trash families in the Deep South before the Civil War. One book. And this guy said, I listened to this guy's talk about his book, and he said, well, it's really hard to find documents on these poor white families. Can you guess why that would be hard to find documents on them? Like the usual sort of historical evidence? What do you think, Ephraim?
I feel like it would be harder because first of all, they had no money to like share, and then like people also just didn't really care about them to preserve what they said, even if they wrote anything.
Yeah. And most of them would have been illiterate. They wouldn't have written, or they wouldn't have written well, and they wouldn't have, no one would have thought their writings, if there were any, would be worth saving. So yeah, he found it very, oh, Joshua, good to see you. Haven't seen you in a long time. Great. So there were just, almost no documents written by these poor white people, but they did exist, and they had pretty crummy lives. And it was often in the South, they would often think, well, the one thing those poor white families had was blank. What was the one thing they had that they could point to? Ashwin.
Being like superior to African Americans or the enslaved African.
Right. That they were, at least they weren't black, that sort of feeling. And but in many ways they were right at the same level, and had very, very limited opportunities. And after the Civil War, the sharecropping, that sort of system, that was actually something that had been done with these poor whites. They'd been doing sharecropping earlier. They didn't own land, they just sort of rented land, and all the profit went to the owner of the land. But yeah, so that, I thought that was interesting that a lot of you picked up on that, what's he talking about, this poor whites business? But that was a thing. And I thought that was almost kind of interesting. And one thing that Adams brings up is the argument that, well, this is an important issue, and I've never owned slaves, I don't like it, but it's just going to fizzle away. And what did you think of that argument from a leader? Does that sound like a good argument or a stupid argument, or Ashwin?
Maybe it's some of that cognitive dissonance he knows is a real issue, but he needs to escape from actually doing anything about it. So that's like the most reasonable excuse he can come up with, and one that would have probably been defended if you looked around Boston and in the area he's around. So he's probably just trying to look for a good reason as to why not to deal with the problem, and that's one that was something he could use. But I'm pretty sure he's a very logical person. You can see the obvious flaw with that. I'm just
Right.
hypothesizing that it's just the kind of dissonance kicking in.
Right. Very good point. How about Tabitha, who's raising her hand? Tabitha.
I was wondering, like, so it seems like quite a few of these people sort of saying, oh, it's just gonna die out.
Yep.
I feel like I could be wrong about this, but I noticed that a lot of them seem like they were from New England instead of the South.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wonder if that was what they were seeing where they lived. So they kind of thought that was how it was everywhere. Because, like, they didn't really need enslaved people as much in England.
That's a good point. And what have they just seen happen? I mean, for Adams here, this is 1801, so it's been quite a while, but what did happen in the North, which the North had slavery, they had enslavement, but what had happened right after the Revolution? What started happening in the North? In every state. Roshan.
Didn't the state start like making laws against slavery, like banning it, freeing the slaves, banning the slave trade? Like not directly saying slavery was bad or completely stopping it, but working against it?
Yes, yes. And it's often called gradual emancipation. Gradual emancipation. Now, how in the world would you gradually emancipate someone? What does it mean? Like, I'm going to gradually emancipate you over the next month? What does it mean? Harriet.
I don't know if this is what you were getting at, but a lot of them would be like, okay, once you turn 28 or whatever, then you can be free. And so like slowly as people hit that threshold, so over the next whatever, like 28 years or something. I
Yes.
don't even know, like if they counted
Yeah.
the newborns not,
Mhm.
then so it was like instead of like everybody at once, which could like have kind of flooded society and been crazy, they like slowly as people turn that age. But then I had a question about that. I watched that video about Ona Judge.
Mm.
How like how would they prove that they were 28? Like I feel like if I was 25, I might be like, no, I'm 28. Like
28.
let me go.
Right, that's a good point. And what Harriet's referring to here about Ona Judge, I don't know if you all saw that as one of the options of, there was quite a few links on. Ona Judge was a personal servant, enslaved servant of Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, owned by Martha Washington, not by George, which again, thinking of legal things, like I know this is something we like to think about only morally, but the legalities were very important in all of this. So Ona Judge was owned by Martha Washington, by her side of the family. You know, she inherited all of her first husband's slaves, and he was a huge slave owner. So she inherited, you know, hundreds of slaves, and they were considered her dowry. George Washington could not touch those slaves. They were not his to free. They were hers. And she could maybe emancipate them, though I don't know if women were allowed to emancipate them. She basically had to, these slaves that she owned in this the dowry slaves, they had to be passed on to her children. They had to be inherited. And that's why, getting back to like Thomas Jefferson inheriting a whole lot of slaves from his father. What do you do with them now that you've got 300 slaves? What do you do tomorrow? You know, it's going to be very hard. And then they're so intertwined with how you're living that it would be very difficult to extricate yourself from it. So I think they legitimately felt trapped. I'm not saying it was right. They shouldn't have done something, but that was a feeling people had. But so Ona Judge, and so when she ran away, Martha Washington forced her husband to try to get her back. And it's a really pretty horrifying story of how hard they worked to try to get her back. And I think George Washington viewed her, and certainly Martha Washington viewed their runaway slaves as being ingrateful. You know, they had been treated very well, and they should never have wanted to run away from the president. And but you know, George Washington was president when Ona Judge ran away, and he didn't really want to make it, you know, a headline thing. George Washington pursues runaway slave. You know, it would be bad press. But he quietly sent people to try to convince her to come back. We'll treat you really well if you just come back to Mount Vernon. We'll really do well by you. You had it better now than you do now in freedom in Maine or wherever she moved. And she would not budge. And I think a lot of slave owners were genuinely shocked, just like as you get into your Civil War projects, and if some of you do ones related to slavery, you'll find a lot of Southern slave owners, I think, sincerely believed that their slaves felt 100% loyalty to them. They loved them. They had raised their children. And they were shocked that, oh my gosh, the Union troops come through our area and all of our slaves left. They all went away with this Union general to run away to freedom and to be soldiers and to live miserable lives, you know, in the trenches. And well, they were happy to be free. So it's a very interesting thing that people can, again, deceive themselves as to what's the motivation of the others that you're in charge of. Okay, but to Harriet, to get back to your, what was your key observation there about George Washington and all his slavery things? I lost the train of thought here. Do you remember?
Oh, I was just talking about the like gradual emancipation
Okay.
and like releasing people when they were 28.
Yes, yes. Okay, back to the gradual emancipation. And yeah, so it was exactly that idea that, there might be a law. The laws all varied by state, because these were all state laws. They were never federal laws. They were always state laws, and that's going to be a problem right up to the Civil War and after. Should this be handled by the federal government or should this be handled by the states? And it had been handled by the colonies in different ways. And then right after the revolution, it was handled by the states in different ways. And people wanted it to stay that way. They didn't want it to suddenly be taken over by the federal government. And so the gradual emancipation would be something along just what Harriet said about after 1782, if you're born after July 5th, then you will be freed if you're a guy when you're 28, when you're a woman, when you're 18. They always had a much lower age for women. Why do you think they had that? Why would the age for emancipation be lower for women than for men? Can you think of any rationale? We're just guessing here. Ephraim, what do you think?
So they could go out and start families if that was possible.
Yeah, maybe the women, they're ready to bear children, let them go out. That's a good idea. Helen, what do you think?
I think men usually did most of the labor, so maybe they didn't need the women as much, so they let them go earlier.
That could be, yeah. And anyone else have another idea? Tell you an idea someone had last year in this discussion. They said, well, young men in their early 20s would be perfect for doing what? Fighting. This is the age of young soldiers. This is the age when young men might not feel responsibility to a family yet. They haven't settled down. And they might be worried that these young men who have been enslaved might feel justified in being really rebellious. Who knows? I've never read anything about what justified this difference in ages, but it was probably some combination of all these things. Good. And so getting back here just to this idea of so many of the founders saying, well, I think we can just kick this can down the road a little bit because after all, it's going to fizzle out. We can just tell. Why could they tell? Why were they wrong? What did they not see in usually like the 1790s or so, 1780s? How about Roshan and then Ashwin?
I'd say that they thought it because, like we said, the states were posting laws that would eventually ban it and emancipate the slaves. I don't think they saw, because they couldn't see in the future, they couldn't see how cotton would become such a huge thing in the South. And then the cotton gin would completely revolutionize it. I mean, you needed even more slaves to make even more cotton to make even more money.
Right.
So they just couldn't see that down the road.
Right. How many times have you not known what the future was? How many times have you, right. Right, that none of us know. We're terrible about projecting the future. And they were looking at things like, okay, well, we're doing okay without slaves, with gradually emancipating slaves in the North. By the way, if the younger people born after such and such a date would be freed when they were such and such an age, what would happen to the parents of those enslaved people? When would they be freed? would they be freed?
Nope.
No, I mean, some of those states would then change their laws over time and say, okay, and after this date, everyone's free, even those 60-year-olds. But there were some time, like you'll sometimes read about the state of New Jersey still had, so many, 35 people enslaved in the 1850s. These would have been very elderly slaves who were not born after the date, and so they were never freed. They were never freed. And people, often people in those states would see the handwriting on the wall and they would, okay, we're just free them all. But not everyone would. And so that was what some of those older people would just be enslaved for life still. Their children might be freed, but they would still be enslaved. But so think about in terms of like the 1780s, the 1790s, and what was the big crop at that time or earlier in our history that used a lot of slave labor in the South? How about Ephraim?
Tobacco kind of, but that started phasing out, so it was beginning
Yes.
to turn into rice and all the like sugar. That was in the Caribbean stuff.
Yeah. Sugar was in the Caribbean. It really didn't come over to the United States until like Louisiana and like the 1820s or something. It was a little bit surprisingly later. But yeah, rice in the deep South, Georgia, where my family moved to in Georgia, there were a lot of rice plantations and tobacco. But as Ephraim said, that was already by this time losing money. It wasn't really profitable. I don't think smoking habits were changing all that much, but maybe they were getting it from somewhere else. It just wasn't that profitable, and it was also terrible for the soil. It was always wasting the soil, and people would have to move farther west and just ditch that farm and start a new one. So it was getting to be not very profitable. So again, if you're maybe even a John Adams who's living in Washington, D.C. now, once they got that started, you're seeing that, okay, tobacco is kind of losing it. That's the big slavery crop up there. He wasn't in the deep South. He wasn't seeing firsthand cotton, and cotton would have just been starting to pick up at that time. And he's not really aware, but he's seeing tobacco go down. Those people in Virginia that were big slave owners that had the 600 slaves, what do you think they were doing with all those slaves if they're not going to be growing tobacco, if now they're shifting to, I think we'll grow wheat, or I think we'll grow corn, or I think we'll grow apples? Is that somebody? It's not really, I don't know who that is. What do you think they're going to do with their slaves? Those Virginia plantation owners. What would you guess? You're just taking a guess here. If you want to make a profit, and Roshan, what do you think they might want to do?
Like maybe rent them out to the tobacco farms that were still open.
Yeah, and that was
Like if you don't have a tobacco farm anymore, rent it out to someone who does. Give them extra labor, you get the money for letting them use your slaves.
Yeah, and that was done more than you'd think, that renting out slaves. Because again, as they were moving into, crops that didn't demand, hundreds of slaves, they would rent out slaves. That was a way you could make a profit off your slaves, and you wouldn't have to feed them, you wouldn't have to house them, you wouldn't have to discipline them, but you could get some money for them. And they would also, besides just renting them out, what might they want to do? Maybe something more permanent.
They might just sell them, like if their farm, the prospects weren't looking great.
They might want to sell their farm and they might want to sell their slaves. Where would they sell them? What do you think, Tabitha?
Probably to farms farther south that were getting started with cotton.
Probably to places farther south that were starting in on cotton, right? And again, it was very hard for people to understand that impact of cotton, because you can imagine like the cotton gin. Anyone know anything about Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin? Anyone know about his story? It's pretty interesting. Where was he from? Roshan?
He was from the South, right?
No, he invented the cotton
Wait.
gin while living in the South. He was from
Oh.
like Connecticut or Massachusetts. I think he went to Yale. He couldn't get a job, a really good job after graduating from Yale. And so he took a job as the tutor for a family from the North who had moved south. I think it was, I can't remember now. I think it was like Nathan Hale's widow or something like that, something like that. But it was a Northern family that had moved south. And now he's going to be the tutor for the children and live on the plantation. And that's where he learned about this problem with the cotton. Do you want to know the story about, the cotton wasn't a big thing because there are two big types of cotton. And one type could only be grown on the islands where my family happened to move to after I graduated from college or graduated from high school, in the Sea Islands of Georgia, islands on the coast. There was this type, it was called long staple cotton, had like long fibers, and it could be grown there and the seeds would just like fall out. It was a silkier sort of cotton and it would grow there. But that cotton would not grow inland in the more inland areas. It would only grow on these islands. I don't know why, but that was the way it was. But this cotton that could grow more inland was very sticky and the seeds were sticky and you'd have to pluck them out one by one tediously. It was a lot of work. And that was what kept cotton from being a viable crop because it was so labor intensive to pick out these seeds. So Eli Whitney, coming down south in like 1 month, he invents this cotton gin, this thing that would separate out the seeds. And it was very efficient. He was always he went to Yale and, he got an academic degree, but he was always by nature, he was someone who loved to tinker and build with things and pull things apart. And so he invented this thing like in a month. Apparently no one in the South could invent a tool, a machine that would do this. They had tried, and he probably built on some of their ideas, but they had not been successful. But he did it very quickly. And but nobody could see at first what this was going to do. Can you imagine that some people might have thought, I wouldn't be surprised if Eli Whitney thought this, that, this will end the need for having so many slaves, because after all, we won't have to have 50 slaves sitting around picking these seeds out of cotton. But instead, as I think it was Roshan or Ashwin mentioned, it just made cotton explode everywhere. So like instead of having 100 acres in cotton, we're going to have 10,000 acres in cotton. And it is labor intensive to grow it. And you need a lot of slaves out there with hoes, caring for the crop as it's growing and picking by hand. They had no machinery. And so therefore you're going to need more slaves. But I could imagine that some people probably thought, oh, this machine, now we won't need so many slaves, but just the opposite happened. So when John Adams or others would say, it's fizzling, it's dying out, let's just let it quietly die, They were probably, they were perceptive for the times, but they were wrong. That happens a whole lot. Oh, Helen asked a question in the chat. She said, were slaves ever sold back into the Atlantic slave trade from the colonies in North America? Well, that's an interesting question. Do you mean like sold back to Africa? Or would you, is that what you mean?
Yeah, back into Africa and that circulation.
We will be learning, I think it's our next document discussion in a month. We'll be learning about something called the American Colonization Society, which is not selling them back, but it's enabling freed slaves to go back to Africa. Okay, so this may be as close as we got. I don't think anyone tried to sell former US slaves back to Africa. That's a very interesting idea, very interesting question. But the Colonization Society really was trying to promote the idea that, you know, there is such an unhappy people here. We're kind of afraid they might revolt and kill us all here. So let's just send them all back to Africa, okay? And we'll be done with it. And they really tried to push that. And it's, in some ways, it seems like a really naive idea. And you'll have to think in your own minds, like, well, what would the enslaved people in America who've been here for 100 or more years, how would they view that idea of going back to Africa? And, you know, so that keep that in mind. That was a great question, Helen. Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions over there. Okay, let me see. I had some other things I wanted to be sure we talked about. Oh, there's one primary source document that I think nobody was able to see because there was a paywall. And I'm going to read part of it. This is a letter from Patrick Henry. You've all heard of Patrick Henry. What's his famous line that he's known for? If you know nothing about Patrick Henry, you know this line. Roshan?
Give me liberty or give me death.
Right, done dramatically. We like that. Very, very good. And so this is a letter that was published in 1860, July of 1860. What's just about to happen? July 1860, like what's going to be happening that November? Ephraim?
The Civil War is about to happen.
The Civil War is going to happen. The election of Lincoln's going to happen, right? So in July 1860, everything is really tense, really getting worse and worse. And suddenly this letter surfaces from Patrick Henry, written in 1773. Okay. So it was like had been in a family, had this letter. And they're suddenly now leaking it to the press. Okay. So they thought this would be useful, probably in the upcoming election, to have this letter circulating out there. So it gets printed in the New York Times in 1860. Here's the letter. Dear Sir, I take this opportunity to acknowledge the receipt of Anthony Benezet's book Against the Slave Trade. So again, another one of these letters, thank you letters for a book against slavery, or here against the slave trade. Anthony Benezet was a Quaker who were some of the early, very active abolitionists. Okay, so he's thanking him. I thank you for it. It is not a little surprising that Christianity, whose chief excellence consists in softening the human heart, in cherishing and improving its finer feelings, should encourage a practice so totally repugnant to the first impressions of right and wrong. 1773, before the revolution, he's saying, if anything's wrong, this is wrong. Anyone know what state, colony Patrick Henry lived in? Ephraim?
Virginia?
Virginia. He's in the South, okay? Wait, see what happens. What adds to the wonder is that this abominable practice has been introduced in the most enlightened ages. Our age is the most enlightened, but here we are. Times that seem to have pretensions to boast of high improvements in arts, sciences, and refined morality have brought into general use and guarded by many laws, all those laws in those colonies, a species of violence and tyranny, which our more rude and barbarous, but more honest ancestors detested. Is it not amazing that at a time when the rights of humanity are defined and understood with precision, Enlightenment thinking, in a country above all others fond of liberty, give me liberty or give me death, maybe he'd already said it, that in such an age, in such a country, we find men professing a religion the most humane, mild, meek, and gentle and generous, adopting a principle as repugnant to humanity as it is inconsistent with the Bible and destructive to liberty? Every thinking, honest man rejects it in speculation. It's speculation in your mind, maybe not in your actions. How few in practice from conscientious motives. And he goes on a little bit more, and then he says, would anyone believe that I am master of slaves by my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living without them. I will not, I cannot justify it, however culpable my conduct. I will so far pay my devoir to virtue, my dues to virtue, as to own the excellence and rectitude of her precepts and to lament my want of conformity to them. He feels cognitive dissonance, but he's not going to do anything about it. Everything we can do is to improve it if it happens in our day. If not, let us transmit to our descendants, together with our slaves, a pity for their unhappy lot and an abhorrence of slavery. So, and he goes on a little bit more, but he's saying, oh yeah, this is a horrible system. I hate it. Every good person hates it. But would you believe I bought my own slaves and I'm not going to give them up? And I would like you to do a little thought experiment here. I'll have something about this in a future update, maybe another month or so, but you get the preview here. This is an analogy to slavery to make it, because we just can't understand this today, right? We think it's morally repugnant. How in the world could they be so hypocritical? This is just terrible. And I want us to think in terms of this analogy, and I'm not at all equating owning automobiles to owning enslaved people, but bear me out. There is a part of radical environmentalists who feel that the private individual automobile is a horrible thing because it contributes to global warming or pollution and accidents, and it's just terrible, traffic congestion. The world would be so much better if we all tomorrow gave up our automobiles, or they had never been invented, and that would be much better. And I know people who've espoused this, and in my update message coming up, I'll share a couple of links on articles with this point of view. Now, how many of you are driving already? Are any of you driving? Okay, I'll know to be careful on the road when I'm in your area. But if you're driving, or how many of your families own cars? Maybe more than one. Okay. What would you say if some well-meaning radical environmentalist handed you an article like that, what would you say to them? What would be your response? And what would be your actual response? How about Roshan?
Yes, cars are awful. There's no better alternative, so until you come up with one, I'm gonna keep using my car.
That would be a good one, right? Yeah. And Tabitha's shaking her head. Yeah, that's probably would do something like that. You might try to agree, which again, we can see our founders here in many of their responses, like, thank you for your letter about the evils of the slave trade. I totally agree with you. It's terrible. But I can't do without them. And Patrick Henry saying, it's the inconvenience of doing without them. How could I? And I think, like, for myself, I live 7 miles from my little town. How would I ever get to town to buy anything or do anything, or let alone go to Pittsburgh, which is 50 miles away? I would never go there if I didn't have a private car. There's no public transportation. There's no other alternative. And I think the slave owners of these times felt equally that there was no other alternative. They couldn't imagine a viable alternative, how they could make money, support their families, live in the style they were used to living in. And I think just doing sort of a little thought experiment like that can sometimes, not that we want to say, oh yeah, I mean, after all, slavery wasn't that bad. I'm not saying that at all, but it can at least give us a little, maybe a smidge of empathy for these people who were indeed, they were living in a world where it would have been very difficult to live without this system going on. And so I just think it's an interesting, helpful way to think about it, I think. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to. Oh, another thing is, many of the founders here talked about the slave trade. What did they mean by that? What was the slave trade? Where were they being sold? What was the slave trade? How about Sarah?
It's the transportation of enslaved people from the ports off the west coast of Africa and bringing them to the Americas or the Caribbean or I guess North America in this particular case, and selling them at auctions.
Right, exactly. So it's the actual across the Atlantic, transatlantic slave trade. When they say slave trade in these days, that's what they're talking about. And that what is often called the international slave trade. And does anyone remember, what did the Constitution say about the international slave trade? Did it say anything about it? It basically didn't say much, but it said it cannot be restricted for 20 years after the implementation of the Constitution. And it was, written in 1787, passed, another year and a half. So 20 years after that, then it could be restricted if Congress moved to do so. It never said it has to be eliminated in 20 years. It did not say that, but it said you can't do anything to restrict it before 20 years. So that's the international slave trade. What would be the opposite of the international slave trade would be the what slave trade? Sarah?
Domestic slave trade.
Domestic slave trade. So what would that be? Give me an example of the domestic slave trade.
selling them between farms or between states.
Yeah, selling them between farms, between states. And going back to those gradual emancipation laws, if you were a greedy slave owner in New York State and you wanted to make some money, you know, you don't want to lose money, you want to be a wise steward of your funds. And you had a bunch of slaves who were like, let's say 24 years old, and the emancipation age for them would be 28, let's say. What do you think you might be very tempted to do with those slaves as they were approaching age 28? Roshan,
Just sell them off to someone else.
sell them south. Sell them south. You're not going to be able to sell them to someone in New York State because no one's going to want them. Although you could, but who would be a buyer? But cotton is coming along in the South. They're needing more slaves. The slave trade internationally has been severely restricted by now. You're going to sell them south. And there were many slave owners in states like New York that did that. So the gradual emancipation laws could sometimes sound good, but they had those sort of little loopholes that led to continuing enslavement for at least some of the slaves. You know, they weren't all freed. They would no longer be counted as slaves in New York. The number of slaves in New York would be going down, but the number of slaves in the South are going up, in part because some of those slaves are just being shifted. And there's some really fascinating, primary documents, discussions of these gangs of, shackled people going from Northern Virginia or New York, going south and being traded south. So that's the domestic slave trade, and that was never stopped until the Civil War. But would stopping the international slave trade be a first step that you would have to do if you wanted to eventually end slavery? Yeah, it's like a first step. It's not going to guarantee that step number 2 and 3 and 4 are going to be taken. But if you don't take that first step, nothing's going to happen. And there was one other time when the international slave trade had been basically stopped. Can anyone think when that was in our history of our country? Like before 1807, when it was ended? Ephraim.
Would it be during the Revolutionary War?
Yes, during the Revolution. Why? Why during the Revolution?
Because the slaves mainly came on British ships, so they're going to war against Britain, so it'd be kind
We're
of
not going to
ironic.
trade. We're not going to buy tea. We're not going to buy nothing from those British. They're having a trade embargo. They're not trading with them, so they didn't have slaves coming in during the Revolution. They'd already had, and apparently, again, all these things are state laws, colony laws. There were a number of colonies. Virginia had been one of them that put in, okay, we're not doing the international slave trade. Now, a little disingenuous because they already had this sort of surplus of slaves that couldn't really be profitably used. So it's not like it was a great moral victory, but and they became like the breeding farm for slaves on the domestic slave trade. And that was how a lot of slave owners in Virginia now made their money off their slaves. Okay. Does anyone have anything else that they might want to bring up? I know we've gone over our hour here, and I appreciate you 6 still staying in here. Anyone else have some final closing points? Nope. Okay, I think this was good. And I think everyone had a chance to say something, right? I think so. Yes. Okay, you all get your extra. So you get 200 points for taking part. I never looked at the chat, or I hardly ever looked at the chat, but if you made a comment there, take your points for that too. And see you next week for our cartoon conversation. Okay, thanks so much, kids, for coming. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Good discussion. Bye-bye. Good to see you, Aiden.